Life's gonna lift him again.
To start off, I bet many of you, even the ones from Bakersfield, don't know that Buck Owens' first name was actually Alvis. You can look it up. It was Alvis Edgar Owens Jr. And you probably didn't know there's a famous English car called the Alvis. Here's a picture. Check out that logo, huh? But the best part is what the word Alvis actually means. Turns out it's a Scandinavian word that means all wise. Huh, well how about that? I wonder if Buck knew what his real first name meant. I bet his dad knew the score. So this show isn't about Alvis Buck Owens, no. And it isn't about the Alvis vintage car either, even though we will be talking quite a bit about cars. I guess you could call this an Alvis car because this is my car and my name is Mark Alvis. But that's not the most important thing. One of my first jobs was photographing weddings. When I first started, I remember being really nervous the night before a wedding. Getting married is a big deal for most people, and I didn't want to screw it up for anyone. I soon found, though, once I actually started shooting, I would calm down and everything would be fine. I knew what I needed to do, and I did it. A big part of being a wedding photographer is telling people to do what they already want to do. The weirdest thing about climate change is that even though we have a great deal of rightful fear and anxiety about it, we already know what we need to do. As it turns out, we know a lot. For instance, if everyone switched to electric cars, we would reduce our CO2 emissions by 50%. According to investment companies' projections, most say the market for combustion-powered vehicles will not exist in 10 years, possibly sooner. Just take a look at how many car companies are now building electric cars. Some are building only electric cars. We already know what we need to do. In some areas, alternative power generation has already reached cost parity with fossil fuel production. And that's without even considering the externalities, as economists call them, the damage that burning fossil fuels does to the environment and to living things. Yes, wind, solar, and hydro have some negatives of their own, but if we consider our real priorities, the decision to switch to clean production is simple. There is no longer a true economic motivation to continue with coal-fired electricity production. And the writing is all over the wall when it comes to burning fossil fuels for transportation. How about our homes? How do we heat and cool and light them? Well, as it turns out, we already build homes that produce as much or more power than they consume. The best way to do this is by making the shell of our buildings, the floor, the walls, and the roof, as energy efficient as possible, and then power them with renewable sources of energy. It has been estimated that the wind blowing in the Midwest of the United States could provide 3 times the power we need. Right now, we can't access all this wind power, but you can see where I'm going. It's sort of like when we discovered oil. We knew it was there, but we still had to figure out how to get to it and how to use it. We may not have understood the science at first, but we do now. The more we burn, the more CO2 we pump into our atmosphere. This has resulted in changes in the oceans, in the animals, and in us. We did not intend or want these changes, but they are happening. Because our current method of energy production, extracting fossil fuels and burning them, is directly connected to our economic system, a lot of people are terrified of changing it for risk of damaging the economy. Not many would argue with the incredible way of life that fossil fuel energy has given us. But a higher standard of living isn't the only thing we get from fossil fuels. We also get the CO2. We don't get one without the other. Now that we know this, the question we need to ask is, would we rather die than give up burning fossil fuels? We already know what we need to do. Bob was working for PG&E when I met him in 1994 doing a story about CNG cars. We've looked to him as our energy guru ever since. Bob not only talks the talk, he walks the walk. In 2002, we installed the first solar array in Sanger on the Riding Ranch, which we have increased since. Now, their solar panels not only power their buildings, but all of their cars as well.
I think it's beyond anything we've ever seen as a species. We've probably been on the planet for, maybe 100,000 years as Homo sapiens. And looking at the record, ice cores and the weather records and the climate that they can actually determine, this is unlike anything that we've ever experienced. This would be equivalent probably to the dinosaur extinctions. And it's not happening quite as fast if it was, say it was a meteor, but it's happening a lot faster than we thought and that even the scientists predicted. So we have to do everything. This is job one. And so we need to all, number one, believe it, and then number two, figure out how we can affect that change and set the example. I think I got woke in college. I came from a fairly conservative family that was in the building industry and construction and automotive endeavors, sales, and my mom was a nurse. So they were professional people, but very typical Americans of the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s. And so my dad, who was a graduate architect, wanted me to either do some kind of engineering job or something because he felt that that was a very stable way to do that. And that was kind of my path until I hit college, and I had my first class was called Man and the Natural Environment. It was a 17-unit cluster, and we had an anthropology teacher, biology teacher, and a geology teacher, and we spent the entire semester looking at how man interacts with the environment and how the environment interacts on humans. And it totally changed my perspective. I went from being kind of, unawake to an environmentalist within, a year. So we just need to be more woke, to use the current term, on how we use water. And it still just amazes me in this desert that we live in. You'll see water in people's gutters in front of their houses because their sprinklers have stayed on too long to water their bluegrass lawn, which shouldn't even be allowed in this kind of climate. So that's the kind of education I think that's needed, is that water it's finite resource. There's no more water on the planet than there ever was, and never will be more. It's a finite and closed cycle. So in my experience, I worked for years with our farmers and our growers with pumping, right? And so energy is required to do pretty much anything to water. If you want to transport water, it's energy intensive. Heating water, cooling water, anything you do, pumping it out of the ground. That water energy nexus is really important. So I have just retired from 40 years of PG&E, and I've done mostly energy efficiency and sustainability work. My last job was economic development, trying to keep jobs in California. Most of my experience in working with food processors, working with farmers and growers, was that in our San Joaquin Valley, which is the breadbasket of the United States, and we provide probably half of the world's food just in the San Joaquin Valley. It's incredible. Most of that is pumped and from the ground, and then also we get a lot of surface water from the Sierras. So if you're trying to grow crops in an area that was historically desert, you're putting a lot of energy inputs into getting the water out of the ground, putting the water on the crops, and then if it's surface water, transporting it through canals, long distances to get that done. So in terms of energy, the more energy you use, unless it's carbon-free energy, such as solar, wind, or hydroelectric, that adds to global warming. So if you can reduce the inputs, you're going to reduce global warming based on that. But water, it just takes a lot of energy. Water weighs 8 plus pounds per gallon, and it takes a lot of energy to do anything with it. Heat it, cool it, whatever. Probably the most robust energy efficiency programs in the United States for the last 40 years. Jerry Brown decoupled the utilities in California back in 1975, 76, meaning he allowed them to advocate for their customers. The utilities, the large utilities, don't make money by selling power. There's a formula that they use, and if they sell more energy efficiency, that's how the shareholders benefit. And it tends to push rates down, which is what we want. So that's one of the reasons I think that in California, we use half of the energy to do the same amount of work as the rest of the United States, because we were on the ball 40 years ago and have these robust residential programs, Title 24. We have the California Energy Commission that's been pushing not only residential and commercial standards, but vehicle standards. We are one of the largest users of electric vehicles, and all these things. Our cars, California has a different standard for emissions on cars. All of these things are what are needed, and it's very hard to do that in a small localized situation. So a local government, a local municipality can do wonderful programs, but they don't have the economies of scale, I don't believe, to affect the level of change that we need. I think it's going to have to be government, and it's going to have to be, the large utilities working together on the energy piece anyway to get that kind of momentum going. So I think the U.S. is less prepared. And I think that has to do with, being a first world country, we have problems that people in second and third world countries can't even imagine. The level of technology has improved to the extent that we are less and less connected to the environment. And so we're not growing a tomato anymore to see how, that process works and the flavor and, so we have not been able to reconnect to the point where we can say, this is important. It's important to be outside in nature. The Japanese call it forest bathing, where you go outside and you hike and you experience nature, and then that has a tremendously positive effect just on mood and relationships. We are so disconnected from that in this country, and there are other first world countries that are similar, but it seems like the Europeans or the Canadians or the Australians have a little bit different way of looking at it than we do. We seem to be, I think, probably a little bit more materialistic, and then that translates into, I want my Starbucks, I want my Amazon delivery, I want it now, and if I don't get it, then, terrible things are going to happen to me. Whereas in other countries, they haven't had those luxuries. And, what were once vices are now habits. And, that is causing problems in terms of climate change. You're not going to get the folks to embrace it, I don't think, as quickly, because they're going to think that they're going to have to sacrifice and they're going to have to suffer and that their quality of life is going to go down, which in reality is the exact opposite. I think their quality of life would go up because they could put down their phones, have face-to-face conversations with people across the dinner table, and realize what's important in life, which is relationships, family, and work that is meaningful and valuable. Thomas Jefferson said, everybody should plant a tomato. Because as soon as you do that, then you're responsible for something beyond yourself, if you don't have kids, right? As a young person, possibly. One of my favorite quotes was by a German philosopher, Schopenhauer, and he said, all truth passes through 3 stages. First, it's ignored. Second, it's violently opposed. And third, it's accepted as being self-evident. And I think the biggest thing that we can do as individuals is education. Whether you're talking about, general education, where we need more science education and more, trade school kind of education, so that people know how things are put together. Not everybody should go to college. That's not it. But it's education. And so with the types of things with climate change, and especially in the San Joaquin Valley, there's a lot of pushback because it's so tied to agriculture, and it's felt that it's an environmental issue, and environmentalists are against agriculture, and they're against, profit, and so that's a big hurdle compared to the coastal cities where I think the awareness is there. We're talking about California now. But they may live in a high-rise apartment building and they have no rooftop solar ability. They are kind of stuck in their, the dynamic of where they live in terms of transportation, in terms of their, there's not much they could do there. So then you do recycling and you do, but education is my answer. They recognize that my generation and my parents' generation and even further back caused these problems. Some of them they had no idea they were causing. Once you understand that you're causing a problem, then it's your responsibility to fix it. My son Andy drives an electric car. Jeff has electric cars in his past stable of vehicles that he's driven, but he's also currently driving hybrids. My wife has said she'll never drive anything other than an electric car. So once you get that understanding of what the technology is and that it's superior to what we've had before, and you can see in my garage I have other things besides electric cars. I like to work on old cars for the historic part of, this is where we came from. So this is the history. I think we're all scared. We're all apprehensive. Where's this going? But you can see these little slivers of light, in terms of solutions. And electric vehicles is one solution. Energy efficiency, use less energy is another solution. But I think that's what's so great about Drawdown is you can look and see that pie chart and all the little slivers, and maybe I can do something about, creating a natural habitat in my backyard for wild birds, right? If you're at the coast, wind is a huge contributor to the solution. And so, advocate for coastal wind power or wherever you are if you're in the prairies. So you just, I think, need to look at what the conclusions of that book are and where can I fit in. Do I have an old refrigerator I can recycle? Can I put in LED lights in my house? Can I put in mini splits? Can I, things like driving less, recycling, all the things that we know are important, but there's all these other things that I had no idea, right? And you had no idea. Until you actually study the problem, you're not going to be able to really understand where you can make a difference. I think the number one solution to climate change in Drawdown was refrigeration. So years ago we started out with fluorinated hydrocarbons, and then we went to straight hydrocarbons, which were a little less reactive. When we had that ozone issue, ozone hole, and the protocols came together within 2 years. They solved that particular technical problem, changed the types of refrigerants we use. And then we're talking about air conditioning, we're talking about refrigerators, car air conditioning, anything that has a cooling system in it that's not a large commercial system, because large commercial systems use propane or ammonia, which are not reactive. The Freon or the refrigerant in your refrigerator, if released into the atmosphere, is 9,000 times as potent a greenhouse gas as a pound of carbon dioxide. That's incredible. So it's very surprising that refrigeration was the biggest thing we could do, not solar, not wind, but refrigeration. Mini splits are a better use of refrigerants because you can specifically heat and cool certain parts of your home, and you don't have to have a rooftop unit that cools the entire house. So number one, you're saving energy, which is greenhouse gases, and number two, you're using less refrigerant because of the way that these systems are set up. So mini splits are incredibly beneficial, and they're also much more energy efficient. The mini split that we put in here uses half of the energy of the air conditioning in my house. And that was still the best air conditioner of the day when I put it in 1992. If you look at the Drawdown book, the top 10, some of those solutions to mitigate the climate, you want to bring it back down to levels that we've had in the last 20 years. In order to do that, not all of these are energy related. Some of them are having to do with educate women and girls so that they stay in school longer. Some of them are things like rewilding places where they used to have buffalo or wild animals grazing rather than using intensive agriculture on that land. So Only part of that's, you know, the solar, rooftop solar is a big part. Wind is a big part. Energy efficiency is a big part. Yes, Manhattan Project is what we had talked about earlier, where you take incredible amount of resources and the best and the brightest, and you figure out technological and social ways to take care of this problem, because otherwise everything that we've based our society on is going to change in terms of where we live, how we live, ability to live. There may be some places that will not grow crops anymore. There are places where you can't live anymore, even with, you know, artificial cooling and heating. So yeah, it's huge. It's huge. So when I started doing sustainability work about 10 years ago, looking at local governments and counting carbon and the emissions factors and, you know, all that, the issue was we need to slow down climate change and do what we call mitigation, do things to mitigate climate change. We've gone so far past that in the last 10 years, we don't even talk about mitigation anymore. We talk about adaptation. So now it's a given that it's going to happen. How do we adapt to it? You know, if you're on the coast, you have rising seas. Do you put up seawalls? Do you, you know, if you're in the valley, we're looking at droughts. We're looking at, you know, excessive heat. So that argument has shifted from mitigation to adaptation, which is too bad, because I think the drawdown book's assertion is it doesn't have to be adaptation. We can bring this back to the levels that we think are sustainable for the planet if we do these certain measures and look at it in the right way. So once you reach that tipping point, is there any going back? Now, every time a volcano erupts and puts sulfur particles in the atmosphere, those tend to cool the Earth. And so if you look at historic cycles and you see droughts in tree ring data, and then you see, you know, in the ice cores, and you can see these variations over time. And typically it had something to do with some climatic event where there was enough of volcanic activity to actually blot out the sun and cool the Earth and change the climate. So there's talk of terraforming, where you seed the ocean with iron particles. There's talk about putting certain types of vapor in the air to block the sun. I mean, there's lots of, you know, what we would consider crazy ideas now, but if you get to that tipping point, you may have to start implementing these, because, you know, the patient's dying. So it's kind of like when we learned about how to do mouth-to-mouth resuscitation and CPR. Don't worry about hurting the patient, because the patient's already dead, right? The only thing you can do is bring him back to life. And that's kind of the analogy that I'm thinking we may have to initiate some type of very either far out or untested technologies on all scales, in you know, in the oceans, in the air, on land, in terms of land use, to get that you know, feedback loop to slow down, because otherwise we're in for it. We really are.
One of the biggest complaints we get when we're working on energy efficiency issues on homes is air conditioning, the bills. To heat and cool a house is one of the most expensive things that you can do. Air conditioning just puts people in the poorhouse sometimes. One of the most expensive sounds you can hear in Fresno during the summer is the air conditioning kicking on. One of the things we've done over the past few years is install mini splits. Dan put this system up on his house probably 5 or 6 years ago, and it's made a huge difference. The idea of putting a different kind of air conditioner on your house is probably somewhat daunting, but we've done 4 or 5 of these, the mini splits, now over the past few years, and every one we've done, the people are just really happy with. They're much more efficient, which means they're much cheaper to run. I would say that putting a mini split on your house is right on the edge of a do-it-yourself kind of project for a lot of people. Probably most people couldn't do it or wouldn't want to, but the benefit is huge. Your bills are a lot less.